part of the Vancouver Startup Week team. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're grateful to be virtually gathered on Indigenous land, regardless of where you're joining us from. As I had mentioned, I'm here at my home in Vancouver, and I'm grateful to be on traditional, ancestral, and the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I want to thank you for joining us for today's session during Vancouver Startup Week 2021, and welcome to Office Space for Startups, Navigating the Where, When, and the Why of Having an Office, hosted by CBRE. As a reminder, if you have questions for our speakers, post them in the Q&A within the Whova platform, upvote questions you want to get asked, and we'll be able to have those asked throughout. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to our speakers at CBRE, and we'll begin the session. Over to you.
Thank you, Leanne, and good afternoon to everyone. Great to see so many of you at the event this week, and we thank you for your time and attention. We'd also like to thank Vancouver Startup Week for the opportunity to provide what we believe to be a very, very topical discussion today on your platform. And Office Space for Startups almost has a question mark on it right now, just given the sort of crazy sentiments back and forth in the marketplace that we're all reading about right now. So as a quick introduction, my name is Kevin Nelson, along with my teammate Alain Rivera. We represent the dominant technology tenant representation team in the city, the High Technologies Facilities Group at CBRE. And what this specifically means is that we represent the interests of technology companies when it comes to finding and negotiating for very cool spaces for your business. Also joining us is Lauren Bergman. Give a wave, Lauren. And Lauren is CBRE's National Workplace Strategist, who not only led CBRE's workplace reinvention the last 2 years, but is also at the forefront of what is trending presently as companies are thinking about how to reinvent their workspace in a post-COVID workforce. So, okay, Len said it, but the ground rules. The objective is for you guys to walk out of here saying that this was time well spent, that the CBRE High Technology Facilities Group is awesome. So with that, we will ask that you interrupt us, ask questions, as it'll help to shape the narrative we're going to work through on our time together. So with that, what a difference a year makes. Like, do you remember these headlines from last spring? I mean, the sky was falling. Everyone was going to work from home forever. And in the early days, people loved it. Alana and I thought that our careers were getting obsoleted as global tech leaders like Amazon, Shopify, Facebook, Twitter had set the course. And smaller tech companies felt they had to follow suit in order to be competitive in attracting and retaining talent. It didn't quite last as long as predicted. And but we really started to see the duplicity in these headlines as we got into about Q3. And it's gained momentum, frankly, right up until today. Expansion, financings, back to work at a greater percentage of time than predicted. I mean, just look at the headlines now. Many of the same groups that had declared work from home forever had done an about face and were making enormous real estate commitments. Amazon took down 2.75 million square feet in Bellevue and another 750,000 feet in Manhattan. Shopify, another 90,000 feet in downtown Toronto. Facebook was buying REI's headquarters for 400,000 feet in Bellevue and then took down another 750,000 in Manhattan. The list kept going on and on. And it was, by the time we hit the close of 2021, there was literally tens of millions of square feet of new commitments by the big tech firms that had so spoken against it previously. But it's not just large global tech companies making these commitments. By Q4, Alana and I saw local groups like Clue and Dooley and Savante with new funding in hand, securing leases sometimes as much as 6 times larger than their current sizes. These companies are hiring and planning for back to the office, and some of these companies have not been in the office physically, still haven't, for 14 months. But it's also not just the expansion that was taking place. Companies that previously had space on the market for sublease, groups like Pay by Phone, Axiom Zen, Thinking Ape, to name a few, have pulled their subleases from the market in the last quarter as they rethink about how their businesses will operate in a post-COVID world. So the sentiment has changed. And the question is why? Well, for employers, let me flip slide there. Employers, it was pretty easy. They had their reasons in the back half of 2020. Productivity, which had held its own for the first 6 months of COVID, slipped. In a CBC podcast I was listening to in April, A survey of Canadian public companies suggested a 22 to 23% decline in productivity as a result of work from home. They also cited that competitiveness and innovation that comes with organic collaboration was hard to replicate. A pure negative was how Netflix CEO Reed Hastings described it to the Wall Street Journal in the fall. Harder to debate ideas and collaborate were the words he used. And as a complete anecdotal, kind of laughable story, a client of mine noticed that the Zoom windows were turning blacker and blacker as the year dragged on, to the point where management decided we want to have staff re-engage. Let's see if they're wearing toques and beards and whatever else. And they had somebody complain that they had to go put a shirt on before they turned on their screen, which really started to make that management team wonder if they needed to do more to get their group engaged and motivated. So, as startups, another very, very important thought for you to consider was that in a poll of 141 Silicon Valley venture capital firms last year, that VCs are less likely to invest in a startup with a fully remote workforce. And this was from the Silicon Valley Business Journal last year. And the reasons they cited were remote companies can be fragile. They have less traction, more turnover, the brain trust is not anchored, and that it will take years of data to the contrary before they change their minds. But as we got to 2021, employees also had their motivations. And this is from the Robert Half Business Consulting report just released this morning, that employees want back to the office at some level for the following reasons: that lack of culture and work relationships equals detachment and not feeling part of something. The remote work rolls into weekends and evenings, and it leads to burnout and loss of sanctity at home. And that work-life separation is essentially a giant mess. There's less sense of ability for promotion and increases in salary. There's an expectation that businesses will adjust remuneration for employees who permanently relocate or work remotely. And as you can see by the headlines in this last slide here, it looks like this is going to cause a massive turnover in employees shortly, that people are picking their moment with when they're going for a career change. So if this is the backdrop on current company and employee sentiment, all teed up, I'm going to hand this over to Alain so he can discuss the impact of the last year on the tech office market, its current status, and how early movers are taking advantage of this moment right now to get set up for their post-COVID workplace. If there's no further questions, over to Alain.
Thanks, Kev. Appreciate that amazing insight and overview. And it's safe to say that a lot is and has been changing. And so kind of going now a little more granular, let's look at, we want to do is just give people a quick overview of what's really happening in Vancouver. Looking at a few stats, we'll keep it really high level and to what matters for startups. And so just looking at this quick overview slide of the vacancy in the orange line, showing the peaks and valleys of the last 20 years. And now looking at where the current rate is, vacancy rate, which is just at 6%. And why that matters is 6% is what we consider a balanced market. So while pre-COVID vacancy rate was just above 2%, very, very low, as you can see the downward trend line in the orange line leading up to the end of 2019, and it's kicked up, but it's kicked up by 3 times. And that's the headline. Everyone thinks, oh, office vacancies tripled. There should be huge discounts. There's tons of space. The real story is there is space, there is choice, but not as much as people think. The pricing hasn't changed as much as people think, and things are starting to level off. So if you're considering, or the company you work for is considering space, what we believe and what we foresee is that things are going to level off and the good spaces are going to get picked off. And it's the right time to do something in the next 6 months, maybe 12 months, but the next little while is really where we see opportunities. And these opportunities we're talking about are the opportunities to perhaps right size. I think by what Kevin said, the office is here to stay. There's going to be a hybrid workforce, a mix of both, and we will see how that really plays out. But the point is, the office is staying, and there's a room and a place for it. Lauren is going to talk a little bit more about how the specifics of the office inside are going to change, but we know it's here to stay. So where are the opportunities? This is just, again, a quick snapshot of the downtown office leasing market. So we're at 6% vacancy overall. And for startups, smaller companies, we're looking at maybe under 5,000 square foot spaces. And most of the opportunities are in that size, which is great for everybody. And also, if you look on the bottom right, you 7% and almost 10% of the overall vacancy is in the B and C class spaces, which are those more affordable options. So while it looks like there's a lot of spaces, some of these are not as nice as we'd think, and really, space still matters, and I think it's going to matter more as we want to encourage people to come to the office and work in a great, beautiful, collaborative environment. To do that, you need a nice space, and the nice spaces are starting to see activity, and that's where we're seeing the vacancy level off. And one thing I wanted to point out is work from home. Sorry, going back, work from home and the office becoming a hybrid model. The CEO of Microsoft recently quoted in Microsoft's very thorough report on why the office is here to stay and how we're going to be in a hybrid environment. He says it's here to stay, and I think we believe that, we echo that. So really, it's just looking at where are the opportunities. So for startups, to get a little deeper into it, we wanted to focus on some sublease opportunities. In the sublease market, for those who aren't aware, that's where a company is trying to get rid of space, and they have a year left, maybe 2 years left on their lease, and they want to get out, and it's furnished, it's move-in ready, the rent could be low, it's a little more negotiable. So as much as we're saying, the opportunities are starting to get snatched up, there are still great ones out there in the sublease market, and I think now is the time to take advantage of it. So looking on these charts, the orange line at 2019, it's spiked up, and it's been basically leveled off, over 100. So, that's where a big portion of the opportunities are and came, but that could change quickly. And something to highlight is that of the 119 listings in the sublease market, we're starting to see, as Kevin actually suggested, a number of companies take them off the market as in they've decided not to get rid of them. They want to keep them for themselves. They've, the vaccine rollout has changed things. They've discussed with their team, they've surveyed, and they've realized, yes, we want to keep the space. We're not going to get rid of it. We're not going to be a remote only company. We're going to keep what we have. So it's just an interesting turn of events to see how that's changing. So again, just to dive a little more into the sublease market, 40% of all vacancies are in the sublease market. So if companies are taking them off the market, the good ones are getting taken, and some of those leases end. Those real opportunities for startups are going to start to dwindle. So as I said, the next 6 months or so look like it's the right time, in our opinion. Now here's just the last quick little interesting data points. As we've, part of the reason that we've noticed through the pandemic of why companies are more prone to subleasing and listing the space for sublease in the downtown core versus suburban. Downtown opportunities have shot up. Suburban markets like Burnaby, Richmond, and further have also gone up, but not as much. And typically you see a 5% gap between the blue line being downtown and the darker line being suburban. But on the far right at Q1 2021, they're almost the same. And that's due to COVID being a real thing, people wanting not to commute and not to take transit. Those are two big things. So the suburban office spaces have actually been kept for the most part. There's less people trying to get rid of them. And so that's just an indicator that as the world opens back up, people might start coming back downtown. And we'll see that, we'll be monitoring that closely. So that's a very quick, a lot of information, very quick presentation on the downtown and where the opportunities lie. And of course, we're free to chat more about this after. I would love to hear everyone's personal opinion. There's a lot of different things. And I guess the one main message is no one size fits all. So, really need to dive deep into what each company's workforce is, how they work, who they are as a brand. Culture is a big thing. And from that, I'm going to hand it off to Lauren to talk about, her view of the work from the workplace strategy perspective.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm super excited to share some great global information, but I want to also give you local anecdotes and really dive down a little bit more into tech specifically and startups specifically and how it might look moving forward. If we go to the next slide, Alain, the one thing that we definitely see more and more is the work from home frequency is changing. And I'm just going to dial up, if you draw your eye to the right-hand side of this page, this was back in 2020, towards the end of last year. Employees were definitely going for a balance of work from home and work in the office, what Alain and Kevin have been talking about, this hybrid work style. So you can see that the sweet spot seems to be this 2 to 3 days a week. That's what we're hearing a lot out there on the front lines. I've been conducting a lot of focus groups with employees. This seems to be where everyone's landing right now. Some are even starting to increase because work from home fatigue has set in. And there are a lot of studies, Microsoft comes to mind, that has one that speaks a lot to this fatigue that's set in. So I think there have been some limitations as to why and how people come into the office, though, that might affect this moving forward. And as Alain mentioned, one of those is transit. But generally, we are seeing our data locally reinforce this number of 2 to 3 days a week and increasing as each month goes by and more people are vaccinated. If we go to the next slide, one thing I wanted to think about specifically for startups is that, you know, you might want to work with your existing space that you already have. And what are some quick fixes to do that versus going on full on into renovation? So microarchitecture is starting to solve the problem of more collaboration spaces being needed, as well as more focus spaces. So this is coming back to the question, why are we coming back to the office? And frankly, this has a lot to do with people coming together, but also maybe figuring out that they're going to need more focus space. You got used to some heads down work at home, and they're wanting more of those types of spaces. So a quick way to solve this that will give you a lot of future flexibility is to use these off-the-shelf kit of parts that are more furniture-based. If we can go back to that, thank you, Alain. The furniture-based solutions, AKA you can take these with you should your needs change or you want to move. But a lot of companies are using this type of approach right now as they start to deal with their existing space needing to accommodate more demand in collaboration and more demand in focus. But acoustics is also very important. So the image on the upper left is one of our favorites because acoustically enclosed rooms are very important. So we can collaborate without disturbing everybody in the office. The next slide that I wanted to just touch on was, well, this is all interesting. If we start to look at potentially a hybrid work style, what does that mean as far as desk sharing? Now, generally tech hasn't done a lot of desk sharing. They might in the future, depending on how many days a week people are going to want to work from home. What we're drawing your eye to here is really about a smart way to do that. It isn't about allowing people to choose their day at random, such as the top green line. You're going to need a lot more seats to do that. You need to bring some structure in as per the light green line so that you don't have like a ghost town on Mondays and Fridays. So this is about organizing your teams if you do embark on sharing desks at all in a bit more of a structured way, but also building in a buffer because we know that people's schedules change. You're going to want to come in on a day that isn't prescribed as your day. So that's something that also needs to be built into the modeling, but you do need to bring some structure into that play. And this is one of my favorite topics right now. Originally in our workplace team globally, we used to talk about, you know, the work styles, what role you do, i.e. deciding whether you'd be a work from home candidate or not. what we're seeing anecdotally, again, on the front lines with focus groups, is it's coming down a lot more to your life stage and whether work from home is even conducive to your lifestyle. So if we go to the next slide, we start to see that depending on where you're at in your career, the next slide, hopefully, there we go. Perfect. We just start to see that depending where you're at in your career, as well as your home life, is starting to determine whether people want to return to the office, and frankly, also determines the frequency with which they want to come back to the office. You know, anecdotally, in Vancouver or Toronto, we know that younger folks are really challenged with perhaps their space at home. They may not have that private home office so they can really focus. So they really want to come back to the office. But there's also the young families that have struggled throughout COVID to be able to find that ability to focus at home. But when we look at, you know, again, these early stages when people are single and really early in their career, building that social network is key. And what we're seeing is that the office is their ability to do that. So as Alain was talking earlier about the office driving culture and dare say really giving that feeling for what it's like to work with your colleagues, more and more that's important at that early stage of your career. And then again, depending on your home life situation, it may start to be that you need these flexible work options as you have a young family and a school age family. So that starts to speak to more of a hybrid work style potentially. Excuse me. And then ending with empty nesters. A lot of those folks have done very, very well working from home and may not need the office as much as others. So looking at roles and maybe, you know, what team folks are in isn't as important as perhaps looking at lifestyles and life stages. And then we also wanted to just touch on this. I think what we've also seen working with employee focus groups is the folks that seem to be introvert versus extrovert. No surprise here. Introverts have been quite happy if they've had a good solution working at home and have been really functioning well. But extroverts have been suffering and really wanting to come back to the office. And I don't know if you are familiar with this book by Susan Cain, but it really gets into the different work styles of introverts versus extroverts. But I will say, yeah, we've seen, you know, a lot of this more extroverted personality reach their threshold towards the end of last year. And we're really wanting to come back to the office. And that was across all market sectors.
Lauren, just to jump in, would you say or would you agree that it's fair to say that, I guess, with the newer hybrid model, really we're going to be able to get a bit of a better balance for introverts, extroverts, and those in between to kind of pick and choose how much face time they want or need and satisfy it in a better way than they could before?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that concept, Alain, because the ability to focus when you want to and then collaborate when you need to is going to be key. And whether you're doing that collaboration virtually or in the office, which we have our next slide talks to the importance of collaboration as a team, face to face. But being able to structure your day according to that is key. So I think it's a win-win for both introverts and extroverts. But again, that all boils down to what your work from home experience is truly like, which we know it isn't a level playing field for all of us out there. The other thing that I think we were seeing with these tech companies and the headlines that Kevin was bringing up earlier was that there was started to be this concern about creating innovation and creativity. And I wanted to just touch on a study that was done by MIT. This is way back in 2012, but boy, does it still ring true today. They talked about here the number of face-to-face meetings had a direct impact on the success of a team. So the right amount of them is really, really important. And these are spontaneous or even planned face-to-face meetings versus virtual. And I dare say that when we think about the Googles and the Netflixes out there, they measure everything as far as team effectiveness and already know this stat. It's been proven within how they have measured their team successfully over the last few years. And I can only surmise by their sentiment now that this is of top priority for them, is to make sure they are creating that culture of fostering face-to-face meetings. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the last part. It's also about those spontaneous one-on-one conversations, those really short conversations where you're just quick learning. And I wanted to just really make sure that we think about this when we talk about startups, because innovation is a key pillar in any startup. You're usually innovating a product and are more nimble than everybody else. So the importance of these face-to-face meetings is going to be key for you moving forward. And then, so if we look at the last slide, I just wanted to say that, you know, it is interesting to think about the why people are coming in. I think it's going to start to change how we build an office in the future. So the current model is on the top to the right. You see the majority of that is with individual space in the dark green at roughly 60%. And then you have approximately 15% of collaboration and 26% of support and amenity. But as we start to foster those more spontaneous face-to-face meetings, and again, answer to the why people are coming in, we're going to start to see a decrease in the individual spaces and really ramp up both the collaborative spaces as well as the amenity spaces that really bring the community or all hands kinds of meetings happening to build that culture. So it's been interesting to see that most people are kind of working within their current footprint, but looking at recalibrating how their office is going to be more geared towards both collaborative space and amenity space. So maybe we could just open up, Alain, I think you were going to maybe field a few questions out.
We could, so yeah, just to comment, that ends our general presentation. We didn't want to go for too long before we get a little more dialogue going. Yes, Lauren, questions. There is a question from Alexander who says, for a tech startup that is funded but still has a team of 5 or less, do you think co-working spaces will dedicate facilities and independent office space as good value compared to a dedicated space? Great question, Kevin. I don't know, do you want to head that one, or you're on mute?
Thanks for the question. The flexibility of a startup is probably paramount. And the one thing about a real estate lease is it can be a bit of a noose until you sort of got a nice path and you know who you're going to be. And so my recommendation, and Elaine can comment as well, but anything below about 7 to 8 people is best served by co-working, because it gives you flexibility for growth. It lets you supersize on the sort of amenities that are going to be available to you in a co-working environment. And you know, your next step after that is you take advantage of the cheaper cost of having your own space. But you do that when you got some mass. So I'd stay flexible.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, I'd completely agree. The benefit as well with COVID is really just shaking up the office world and who has an office and how big it is and all of that. So there's a lot of change in the air, and the co-working companies have, you know, they've lost some people, they've also gained some people. So as far as I know, and we know, there are opportunities. They are starting to get filled in the last month. That started to pick up. So, you know, to answer that question, yeah, if you're under 10 or under 7, even as Kevin said, that's generally the best option, because it offers the most flexibility in terms of short-term commitment. It is maybe, you know, a bit, higher price on a per person basis, but you're not at that critical mass yet to make sense of a bigger space. And we typically see, dedicated office space start at around, 1,200 square feet, 1,000 square feet or larger, which is generally around, 10 people.
And it really also reinforces a key pillar that we're talking about with all of our clients, which is building in that flexibility as much as you can. And there's no better model for flexibility than that model. And Kevin, maybe you could comment on this. They've also looked at building smaller suites for folks too, so you don't have to be part of a larger pool. I've seen that as part of their safety during obviously the last 15 months, but those smaller suites seem to be somewhat enticing too.
Yeah, and that's co-working small suites. Small suites are what you cannot find in a sort of free market real estate deal with their classic landlords. So co-working all the way to 7, 8, 9. And then after that, you sort of are ready for your own unit.
Yeah, it serves a purpose, and it also gives people the time to see how they work together, how they want to work together, and take that and move it to the next space.
We always talk about talent attraction on our team here about, how do smaller companies compete? And that's the one other bonus, as Kevin was saying, having those amenities there is also a huge plus to help you compete when you can't offer perhaps those amenities if you had your smaller suites. So talent attraction is, I'm sure, top of mind for all of you.
Yeah. Quick question for Kevin and Lauren. So comparing May 2020, when 2 months into the pandemic, and from our perspective, it was offices, no more office space. We need to get rid of it. How do we cut costs, et cetera? Versus May this year, 2021. What's the biggest change that stands out?
It came back with a vengeance. There's almost revenge decision-making happening right now, and everyone's placing bets for August, September occupancy, anticipating vaccinations and Bonnie Henry letting us off the leash. And, last year it was, no one knew. The whole sort of market had frozen completely. We're well beyond thaw. We're into vigorous activity at the moment. So it's a very different year.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the conversations we were having in May, and it was almost like, oh, well, we could do this a long time. And a lot of our clients were saying, they've been so productive for those first few months of the pandemic, and we're really happy. And then by May of this year, I can say even our most conservative, and I dare say cautious clients, were clamoring to come back to the office. They were just, there's been so much pent up demand. So I think, as Kevin was saying, as the pandemic has started to shift, boy, has that affected our clients at the same time. And I dare say they're not going to have perhaps enough space, because funny enough, there's still been a lot of growth over the pandemic. And that seems to be kind of a consistent theme. So they're trying to work with their work from home frequency, but appeasing all the employees that really want to come back for at least a good portion of the week.
Yeah, that's great. Lauren, just a segue, actually, I guess at the start of the pandemic, leaders at the start of, I guess May 2020, leaders of companies, HR, CEOs who were kind of in the room trying to figure this all out, really started to lean in and listen to their employees to see what they wanted. And curious how the decision-making for office space and how a company is going to work, how they're going to interact, scheduling, et cetera, how that decision-making maybe is changing, or how it's getting done even in general, who's in the room.
Yeah, great question. Thinking back again to all the employee surveys that were conducted directly from our clients. They were doing them themselves, often led by their HR department. And they were really trying to gauge the sentiment of their employees, how they were doing, how they were adjusting to work from home, etc. maybe even what they thought about working from home for the long term. And then towards the end of 2020, it started to really shift. And it started to be that HR and the C-suite was starting to say that they wanted this to be more of a leadership driven solution. As Kevin alluded to, we started to see changes in those high productivity gains that started to shift down. Engagement, also by Gallup, started to shift downward, and innovation started to come down. So I would say over the last 6 months, it's been more leadership driven, but again, not with a one size fits all. There are unique situations for each and every employee that you need to accommodate, and that is taken into account. But generally, it's far more leadership driven. And I think managers have really had a difficult time keeping track of productivity and also keeping their employees engaged. It's been a lot of work for managers to keep track of this as they've been moving forward. So a lot more time is needed to kind of get everybody together and keep tabs on everything and make sure your employees are happy and engaged. It takes a manager's time and energy throughout their day. So it's really shifted, I dare say, from far less employee driven to more leadership driven.
So just to add to that, would you say is it fair to say that employees should obviously voice their preferences, their concerns, but managers and decision makers are taking all of that data and rather just trying to listen to the loud employees, they're trying to look at the collective and then make a decision that's, I guess, holistically best for the company to drive productivity? It kind of all seems like it's all coming back to that.
Yeah, I mean, productivity and innovation, especially for startup, innovation is a key word. But I would say that if you're trying to move the dial in your organization or your company, you need to make your voice heard. And that's either through, someone that's working on people and culture, or your office manager or your direct manager. It's got to be voiced because they're making decisions right now as far as their spatial requirements based on what's going to work well for the company. So you need to make sure you get that voice heard.
Yeah. Something we talked about yesterday briefly when we were prepping for this, Lauren, was just how, what companies are the leaders and what companies should startups look to. And I know, some of the quotes and names that we put out there, they're the big tech, the FANGs of the world, but they have the data, they have the information. And so who are the kind of the leaders and who's, in your mind that we should just look to even from a small startup perspective?
Well, I'm going to share this answer with Kevin because we've both been in the industry a while, and I was thinking back, Kevin, to over my entire career. I can't think of a time when tech, specifically real innovators like Google, didn't start to have a profound influence on every single sector. Throughout my entire career, they've kind of paved the way.
Google.
Can't think of a time when they didn't, frankly. So it may not be that we take all of their pieces into consideration. It's not like people duplicate it, but they are known as leaders as far as understanding really good team dynamics and successful teams. As I mentioned earlier, they measure every part of what makes a team successful. So again, I'm surmising that because they are returning to the office and really fostering that, they too are advocating for those face-to-face meetings to be an important part of each person's week if they're trying to innovate. So I think looking to a company like Google will continue to drive our market. It always has. I can't see it being any different. They haven't proven me wrong. They have some of the best data out there when we compare them to other tech companies. So I hold Google up there on a pretty high platform.
Yeah, on the pedestal, and makes sense to me. And I think for the startup community and around the world in Vancouver, they're trying to create something new, different. They're trying to, change the mold and be innovators. And to do that, you need to innovate and gather and be together to share ideas and build upon one another's. And from what Google is that company as well. They're trying to innovate. They're trying to keep ahead of the pack, and they do. And they've decided that they need to be together. So it's kind of interesting to hear.
But they're all about data, right? And so are we. You have to measure this stuff. You can't just kind of do it in a way that's like, oh, I think this works well or that might work well. They don't guess at this. They measure it.
Yeah.
And we're strong believers in evidence-based solutions. And I think that's why we feel that kinship to a Google, because they do provide the evidence on how they've arrived at that success. So again, it isn't a model that needs to be replicated, but the data and some of the findings I think are frankly great for everybody to learn from across all sectors.
And then Vancouver-centric non-tech Lululemon it's
Yeah.
basically in their DNA to try and push the line on the human experience at work. So they're a great model as well.
But Kevin, when hasn't tech led the way in our Vancouver market, right? As far as the direction that our other clients take, as well as smaller tech companies. Like, it seems to be something that's been embedded in our world for 25 years.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I guess we're kind of up on 45 minutes, which is our time. And so I wanted to turn it back over, well, I guess to the back, but see if there's any last questions from the audience. And if not, I guess we will say, thank you to this Vancouver Startup Week. Thank you to the tech community. We love being a part of it. And we love meeting new companies and just trying to help them navigate this kind of interesting time. And would encourage anyone to reach out to us directly. And we're free. We're free for conversations. We're available, and we'd love to meet and love to chat and hear what's going on in your world, and if there's any kind of help or any direction that we can put people on.
Couldn't have said that any better myself. So with that, thank you to the team here at CBRE. Thank you to the attendees for joining us for this session.